Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to get spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. This is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors, Mary Marshner, Kimiko Dunbar, Vivian Lay, Catherine Sulkowski, Kitan Patel, and Clay Smith. Okay, let's skip straight to the third article, titled The Probability of Reducing Hospitalization Rates for Bronchiolitis with Epinephrine and Dexamethasone, a Bayesian Analysis out of +1. As things stand, national guidelines recommend only supportive care for bronchiolitis and do not advise the routine use of most other treatments, just some hydration and a little bit of oxygen as need be. Things like nebulized epinephrine, steroids, salbutamol are not recommended. However, there is some evidence that sometimes points to benefit for these treatments. An example of that would be the CAN-BEST trial, which was conducted fairly recently and investigated whether or not epinephrine with dexamethasone was beneficial for babies with bronchiolitis. Now, I say this was positive data, however, it was actually a negative trial. Despite the original trial showing a 35% reduction in hospitalizations compared to placebo, after they did their reanalysis with an adjusted model, there was no longer a statistically significant difference. Now, reading this article, it seemed like this kind of peeved the authors of this present article, and they didn't seem to be made very happy by this. Indeed, they really went out of their way to try to make the CAN-BEST trial positive. What they did instead was to do a Bayesian analysis. Now, we've talked a little bit about Bayesian analyses before, and this article is actually a really good explanation about what a Bayesian analysis is. However, I'd say it's a really good example of how not to do it all the same. And if you believe the authors of this study, then it seems like the whole of bronchiolitis treatment depends on this one study, and that's simply never going to be the case. Try not to hinge your practice on single studies pretty much ever. Now, what this Bayesian analysis showed was that there seems to be over a 98% probability that giving Epi plus Dex will reduce the number of hospitalizations compared to placebo for young infants with bronchiolitis. Now, here's where they kind of lost me a little bit. Now, for Bayesian statistics, what you have is prior knowledge. So you incorporate prior knowledge into your statistics. So what I think you ought to do is take concrete numbers that you have from prior studies and incorporate that. This is kind of like doing a meta-analysis. So, truth be told, you'd be better off doing a meta-analysis, really. And especially since, at least for these authors, they were able to kind of pick and choose papers that they thought were the most representative, and not necessarily using an objective representation of the other evidence. And it's this huge amount of subjectivity, and just the way the authors write this whole paper, they seem to be highly biased in the direction of Epi plus Dex for treating these infants, that the whole thing seems really biased. And so they give you two ways to interpret this data. If you're highly skeptical of the effectiveness of EpiDex, then there's only a 90% chance that it reduces hospitalizations by 10%. But if you're not skeptical, if you're in huge support, then there's a 98% chance. And that is just not the way science is supposed to work. The whole point is that we're trying to get an objective measure. And you only need to be moderately skeptical to have that credible interval touch 1. I just hate all of this wording about how skeptical you are or not, and this will affect the data. It just shouldn't, really. I wouldn't call this degrees of skepticism. I would call this bias. This is why we do RCTs, to avoid bias. They even list it in their limitations. A limitation of this analysis is that alternative prior distributions could have been considered and would have changed the results. And so they say themselves that they could have fudged the results in either direction, which they then go on to say that they indeed did this. They say, however, by being explicit about our prior definitions and assumptions considering a previous range of studies and a data-driven priors, we allow the reader to determine which view and analysis aligns most closely with their beliefs. That's so antithetical to the way science is supposed to work. It doesn't matter what you believe. It matters what actually happens in the real world when you give these treatments to patients. I don't like this article one bit. I was not so skeptical of Bayesian analyses before, but wow, this is really bad. You know what's called when you cherry pick statistical approaches until you find a significant difference? P-hacking. I'd bet they wouldn't have tried to publish this if they hadn't found positive results. In a spoonful, if you purposely bias the results of a previous trial, then you'll get different results. That's my takeaway. I'll wait for a meta-analysis that includes the CanBest trial instead of looking too deeply into this article. Okay, and then let's move on to the fifth article, titled, Look Me in the Face and Tell Me That I Needed to Be Transferred, defining the criteria for transferring patients with isolated facial injuries, out of the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery. Yes, that was really the article title. Now, this article comes from the same authors that published the brain injury guidelines, and they essentially tried to do the exact same thing, but just with facial injuries this time. There are a lot of specialties out there that get transfers to specialized hospitals for things, and the patient shows up, and they didn't really need to be sent there in the first place. Now, of course, there's going to be some cases, a few cases are going to be unavoidable. However, the more of these that we can prevent, probably the better. These urgent transfers, they're very expensive, they're difficult on patients, they're difficult on the healthcare system in general, and so if we can avoid it, great. This doesn't mean that they don't need to see this specialist right away per se, but if they don't need a stat transfer, I think that's something that we should try to avoid. So these authors looked at the last 5 years of transfers to their level 1 trauma center just for things that were transfers for a facial fracture of some kind. They have 511 adults which fit this description. Now what they did was they sat down, they looked at the literature, they gave some expert opinions, and they came up with a list of facial fractures, and they said for these ones, this was a justified transfer, and for these ones, it would not be justified. And then they looked at their data and saw how true that really was. It was a justified transfer if the patient arrived at the receiving site and immediately were transferred from the emergency department to the operating room for an emergency intervention, or they underwent some kind of intervention during their hospital admission, or they were admitted just for observation as a result of their facial fracture. 49% of all of the patients transferred, 511 again that was, were appropriate transfers. The rest they deemed to be inappropriate as they did not receive kind of immediate intervention or observation, and thus likely could have been seen as outpatients. But even in this context, only 5% of the patients who were deemed to be unnecessary transfers actually got outpatient procedures. So again, these patients need to be seen, but not necessarily urgently at a specialized center. So here's some examples of things that were obvious patients that you should transfer. If they have a frontal sinus fracture, transfer that patient. If they have a nasoorbital ethmoid fracture, transfer. If they have a Lefort type 2 or type 3, transfer. However, some things you should not transfer are type 1 Lefort fractures. If you have a hard palate fracture, leave them alone. A maxillary alveolus fracture, leave them there. And then there were some things that were dependent on whether or not there was high-risk features, like an orbital fracture. Only 43% of the orbital fractures were deemed appropriate transfers. However, if you had restricted ocular motility, then 100% of those fractures were appropriate. If you have a retrobulbar hemorrhage, then again, 100% of those are definitely appropriate. A comminuted orbital fracture, again, always appropriate. So there are some subclasses of larger classes which can be appropriate, but not all of them. The text even really goes through each fracture type and kind of justifies their thinking for each one. It's a very interesting read. Though I am not a facial surgeon of any kind, of course, so it's hard for me to really appreciate some of the finer details. The decision algorithm looks really complicated. I prefer just the table that they set up, which is even color-coded. That looks way better and easier to follow. I might keep this in consideration for the future once it's validated, for whether or not I get an emergent consultation in the ED even. In a spoonful, I'd say you should keep an eye out for the validation of the facial injury guidelines, which can sit right up next to the brain injury guidelines from the same authors. Okay, that's all the articles I have from this week. Let's do a quick review of everything we talked about. From the third article, Bayesian statistics are cool, but they shouldn't necessarily be biased. This reanalysis did not sell me, but it was a pretty good primer about how Bayesian statistics work if you just like to read it for that reason. And then from the fifth article, the facial injury guidelines are now live and they need to be validated. Now, if you were hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles out of the 5 that we covered in this past week. What were those articles that you missed about? Well, one was about our first-line treatment for community-acquired pneumonia. Another was about the warning signs of severe pertussis in infants. And then shock index, is it helpful in non-hypotensive patients? Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to read less, learn more, and save lives, one spoonful at a time. Thank you.